Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a good week. So today we're going to start on learning objectives and Bloom's taxonomy. I'm going to give you a couple weeks on this one because these are the two concepts that are probably the most important things that you will learn in this class, because all your lesson plans, all your instruction will always be based on a good, strong learning objective. Often I hear the elementary faculty say that the biggest problem they have with students is that they don't know what objectives are. They'll start with an activity, but then they don't know what the objective or what the purpose of the activity was. They just did it because it was fun. And so we know what the standards are, and from those standards we develop objectives. And then from those objectives, we'll figure out how we're going to assess the learning, and then the last thing we do is figure out how to teach it, the activities we'll use. So let me switch to the PowerPoint and I'll start showing you stuff about learning objectives. So when we talk about learning objectives, an objective is basically the foundation that we build our lessons on and assessments on. You can think of them as a tool that'll help you reach your goals. And the learning objectives are very specific and they're student focused, whereas goals are much broader. All right, so the purpose of objectives is not to restrict spontaneity or constrain your education. It's just to give your lesson focus. So the importance here is that your objectives have to be clear. And we're going to talk about the different pieces that will make your objectives as clear as possible. So start off, we'll talk about the types of objectives. We have cognitive, we have affective, we have psychomotor. Cognitive objectives are the main ones that we will use in our class. They're intellectually based, and so they're all about what the students have learned, what the students are able to do after they've learned something. The other type of objectives would be affective. Affective objectives are ones where you're trying to change someone's attitude or have them appreciate something. And I have here a video that you can watch that has to do with a great example of a commercial, but it was an experiment that had an affective objective in terms of changing people's point of view. Then we have psychomotor. Psychomotor are like fine motor skills. You'll see it often in PE or maybe in music if you're looking at how they play the instrument, their technique, things like that. Here would be an example of a special education teacher teaching about a lesson that she did where the objective was to help students develop their fine motor skills. So the development of the fine motor skills would be the goal, whereas the objective would be for the students to create whatever the necklace or whatever it is that they're creating. All right, now going to the cognitive objectives. We have Bloom back in 1950s designed what we call Bloom's taxonomy. And what this involves is you're trying to get learning objectives that go from lower order to higher order thinking skills. So in the lower part down here with application, comprehension, knowledge, those were all lower order thinking skills. And then the higher order thinking skills were analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. In 2000, one of Bloom's students said, our focus isn't really correct here. We should be more thinking about the action that we expect the students to do and focus it on the students rather than focus it on the objective and the level, but what we're asking the students to do in terms of their level of thinking. So they changed it to verbs like remembering, understanding, and applying. And those would be your lower order. And then in the higher order, you have analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So it's pretty much the same as the old. Evaluating and creating have kind of switched places. All right, so how do we write learning objectives? There's 4 key elements to writing a good learning objective. One, the first piece is, who's your audience? And this is usually for us as teachers, it's the students. The students will be able to do what? And so your students are your audience. Next is the behavior. What is it you want your students to do? It needs to be something that you can observe, and it needs to be something that you can measure. So if I say the students will understand multiplication, that's not a good objective because I don't know what somebody looks like when they understand something. If I say the students will solve 10 multiplication problems, now I can measure something, because if they're solving something, that means they're going to have some type of answer or product that I can assess. Next is the condition. The condition is how will the students be demonstrating this behavior? So it could be that the condition could be after something occurs, then they'll be able to do this. So like after they've learned their multiplication tables through 12, they will be able to begin working on, or they'll be able to solve word problems that involve multiplication, problems that are under 12. Then the degree of mastery is, what is the criteria? What is the minimum score a student can get and still show that they've mastered the objective? So for you as the teacher, you may decide, well, they need to get at least 80%. That's the lowest I'll take. Okay, then that's what you take. The decision is yours. You're the teacher. Now, if you leave off the degree of mastery, then the assumption is that it has to be 100% correct. Okay, moving on. The other piece is to make sure your objectives are what they call SMART objectives. And all that means is they have to be specific, meaning I know exactly what it is the students are going to do. It needs to be as concise as possible. They need to be measurable, so I can actually do an assessment. I know what I'm looking for, and I can tell people what I'm looking for. They need to be achievable. I don't want to give students an objective that they can't succeed at or achieve, because then it's just a wasted time. They need to be relevant. The student has to understand why the objective, why what they're learning is important. I'm sure you've never done this when you were in school, but sometimes students will say, why are we learning this? What will I ever do with this? This is important. This is what makes it relevant. Know why you're doing something and why you're teaching something. Finally, it needs to be timely and time-bound. Don't say the students will learn how to divide fractions when you're in the first week of second grade. Because if they're going to do that, it won't be till at the end of the year. And you need to make sure it's timing in terms of it's achievable. Don't give them a really long task and then tell them they do it in 10 minutes. Because if you're doing that, are you really measuring their ability to do something, or are you just measuring how fast they can do it? And there's a big difference there. All right, so let's look at some examples. Oh, one other thing, if it helps, sometimes we have audience, behavior, condition, and degree. That's ABCD. And then what it would look like would be students, identify the noun and verb, give a standard sentence, and then without error. So given a standard sentence, the student will be able to identify the noun and verb without error. So what you have here, there's your audience as student. Identify the noun and verb, that's your behavior they're going to identify. Given a standard sentence, that's the condition. They're going to be given a sentence and they're going to identify the noun and verb. And it has to be without error. Now, they could have left out but without error, and that would have been assumed. Okay, for some people, it maybe make it easier, instead of saying A, B, C, D, is to think who, what, how, and how well. So you're saying who will be demonstrating the behavior, what observable behavior will they be demonstrating, how will they be asked to demonstrate that behavior, and what is the minimum score they must achieve to indicate they've met the standard. So in this example, we'll say, once again, the same example, given a sentence, the student will be able to identify the noun and verb without error. So who is the student? What is they're going to identify the noun and verb? How? They're going to be given a sentence. And how well? They're going to do it without error. Okay, so now let's look at some examples of some well-written objectives. And what I've done is I've put these into different colors so that the different elements, the A, B, C, D elements, are easier to find and see. And I recommend that you do this as well when you're first writing objectives, to make sure you have all 4 pieces. And it also makes sure that your objective is clear. So here's an example of an objective at the understanding level of Bloom's taxonomy. Given examples and non-examples of the constructivist activities in a college classroom, the students will be able to accurately identify the constructivist examples and explain why each example is or isn't a constructivist activity in 20 words or less. So there it is. The student is your audience. The behavior is they're going to identify constructivist examples and explain why each example is or isn't a constructivist activity. Now here's a problem with this objective. We have two verbs, identify and explain. So this is a problem. We should only have one verb in an objective. And so what I would say is what should have happened is the student, they could have left this part out because they can't identify the examples if they don't explain why it is or isn't. So I would have left this part out and said the students will be able to explain why each example is or isn't a constructivist activity in 20 words or less. That's much easier, much more clear, much more concise. If you have two verbs in an objective, then you have two objectives. And that's not a bad thing, but you just need to recognize that you have two different things going on there. Okay, here's another example. Given a sentence written in the past or present tense, the student will be able to rewrite the sentence in future tense with no errors in tense or tense contradiction. For example, I will see her yesterday. So this is at the applying level. They're applying their knowledge of sentence tense. And so we have the student is our audience. They're going to rewrite the sentence in future tense. So rewrites their behavior. That's the verb. How are they going to do it? They're going to be given a sentence written in past or present tense. And how well do they have to do? No errors in tense or tense contradiction. All right, next is a creating level. Given two cartoon characters of the student's choice, the student will be able to list 5 major personality traits of each of the two characters, combine these traits either by melding traits together, multiplying together complementary traits, or negating opposing traits into a composite character, and develop a short storyboard for a cartoon that illustrates 3 to 5 of the major personality traits of the composite character. This is not an example of a well-written objective. This is an example of a poorly written objective, so I will cross that out. So what you have here is when you get into creating level, you can see that it gets much more difficult to figure out what the degree of mastery should be. And we have a bunch of verbs here. We have that they're going to list, they're going to combine, they're going to composite into, and develop a short storyboard for a cartoon. All right, so really the primary thing we're asking them to do is develop a short storyboard for a cartoon. Now, really, when you get into something like this, it should be probably a rubric. And in that rubric, you might include that they have to have 5 personality traits for each of the two characters. They need to make sure they combine the traits by melding them together. And you can have assessments based on, high, medium, low, or whatever. And that they have to illustrate 3 to 5 of the major personality traits that come up. Those all could be part of a rubric. And so then what you would have to say is they're going to develop a short storyboard for a cartoon that meets at least 4 of the 5 standards in the rubric, or at least, it scores at least an 80% on the rubric, whatever you want to do. But when you get into that many things that you're checking on, you're looking pretty much at a rubric instead of just they need to get 70% correct kind of thing. All right, here's some issues of when we have some problems with objectives. Sometimes they get too vast or complex. And that's usually because your objective's too broad or there's more than one objective, like you have more than one verb. And what you need to do is just break it apart. Sometimes you have false missing behavior or missing condition or missing degree, and the objective doesn't list the correct information. So all you have to do is go back and be more specific. Make sure your behavior's there and it's clear and measurable. Make sure the condition is there if it's important. And make sure your degree of mastery is included if it's something different than 100%. Make sure you're only the topics are listed. Don't describe the instruction. Don't describe how you're going to do it, how you're going to teach it to them. This is strictly the student, focused on the student and what they will accomplish by the end of the lesson or after the lesson is over. And then make sure everything is listed and is performance-based. Describe what behavior you can observe. All right, Let's look at some more examples. All right, what is this objective missing? The student will be able to run the 100-yard dash in less than 50 seconds. Is it the degree missing? Is it the audience, the behavior, the condition? You're right. It's the condition. Under what conditions will this assessment occur? Will it be on a track? Will it be up a hill with a 45-degree slope? So if you leave out that important part, then we don't really know what it is our students are achieving. Because that could make a big difference if you're looking for students to do this on a track as opposed to a 45-degree slope. All right, here's another one. What should a goal contain? Remember we talked about goals earlier. Are they broad, generalized statements about what is to be learned? Are they specific, narrow statements about what is to be learned? Are they an audience, a behavior, a condition, and a degree? Well, we talked about it earlier. A goal is a broad, generalized statement about what is to be learned. Okay, what is this objective missing? Given the appropriate text, the student will recite a famous poem from that text. So, is it the audience, the behavior, the condition, or the degree? Correct, it's the degree. How must the student recite it? Flawlessly with expression, leaving this component out makes it very difficult to assess the student performance. So in this particular case, if you didn't put the degree of mastery in, as in this case, then we would assume that the student has to do it perfectly. And we're not asking, it doesn't look like we're asking for anything in terms of drama or expression or anything like that. All we're asking is that they recite the words correctly if there's nothing else there. All right, what should a well-written objective show you? Should it show you covert student behaviors? Should it show you specific, measurable, observable student behaviors? Should it show you how to teach the subject? Should it show you the domain you're interested in? Correct. It's specific, measurable, observable student behaviors. If you can't see it, hear it, touch it, taste it, or smell it, you need to rewrite the objective. Okay, here's another one. A good objective contains an audience and a behavior, an audience, a behavior, a condition, and a degree, some way to make sure the students learn what they should. Right. It has to have audience, behavior, condition, and degree. Okay, let's look at, now we're going to look at some more examples of objectives at the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So at the remembering level, we're looking at who, what, where, when, how. So, for example, a verb for the remembering level could be describe, what is, identify, that kind of thing. So here would be an example. Given a dictionary, the student will be able to write the definition of democracy without error. What would that look like? Do we have all four elements? Let's see. Given a dictionary, the student, that's the audience, what's the behavior? They're going to write the definition of democracy. How are they going to do it? They're going to be given a dictionary and without error. So this is important that we know they're being given a dictionary, because it's a completely different level of Bloom's if they're putting it into their own words than it is copying out of the dictionary. Now here's another one. Without reference materials, the student will be able to write the definition of democracy without error. Once again, this is at the remembering level. And here's the key to that. You got the student, they're going to write the definition, they're not going to have reference materials, and it's without error. The key here, if it would have been moved to the understanding level, we would have said they're going to write the definition in their own words. Okay? But here we're expecting them to write the definition that they've learned in class, not explain it into their own words. All right, here's some examples at the understanding level. And when we talk about the understanding level, here's some different types of questions or tasks we could ask. We could say, retell in your own words. What's the main idea of? What differences exist between blank and blank? Write a brief outline. So let's look at some examples. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to accurately describe Newton's 3 laws of motion in their own words. So what would it be? Students describe Newton's 3 laws of motion in their own words, condition by the end of the lesson, and they have to do it accurately. Okay, next, the students will be able to summarize the main events of a story in grammatically correct English. So here we have it. Whoops, that's not correct. The students are going to summarize the events in a story. They're going to do it in English, and it has to be grammatically correct. All right, now let's look at some applying level. This is the highest level within the low-level thinking skills. So how is blank an example of blank? How is blank related to blank? Why is blank significant? Describe an example of when blank happens. So you have to have an understanding of these concepts in order to answer these types of questions. You're applying your knowledge of something in order to be able to answer them. So here's our example. Given a multiplication table, the student will be able to compute 3-digit by 1-digit word problems with at least 80% accuracy. So they're applying their knowledge of multiplication to be able to answer the word problems. So it's the student. They're going to compute 3-digit by 1-digit word problems. They're going to be given a multiplication table, and it's with at least 80% accuracy. So this is important that you know they're being given a multiplication table, because that's a condition. If we didn't have that there, we would assume they don't have a multiplication table to work with, and they would just be using their own knowledge of multiplication. So when we're doing something like this, this shows that we're really concerned about, can they solve these word problems, more than are we making sure their multiplication is correct. Because a lot of times people know how to solve the word problems, and they'll make a mistake in their multiplication even though they know how to multiply. And they might end up getting it wrong when they actually understood the problem. They just made a little mistake in multiplication. All right, given a paragraph with all letters in lowercase, the students will be able to underline the letters and words that should be capitalized with at least 80% accuracy. All right, so here the student's going to do it. What's the condition? They're going to be given a paragraph with all letters in lowercase. They're going to underline the letters and words that should be capitalized, and they're going to do it with at least 80% accuracy. All right, let's move to the next level, analyzing. This is where we start doing the higher order thinking. What are the parts of? Classify this according to. Create an outline concept map of. Provide evidence that blank is correct. You know, you think about it. If I'm asking you to create an outline or a concept map, I'm having to analyze something in order to be able to create those concept maps. So here would be an example. Given 2 or more versions of the same story, the students will be able to use a graphic organizer to compare and contrast the stories, identifying at least 2 things in common and 2 differences. So what's that look like? So we have the students. They're going to compare and contrast the stories. They're going to be given 2 or more versions of the same story and use a graphic organizer. And they're going to identify at least 2 things in common and 2 differences. All right, now at the evaluating level. This is where you're going to select the best product. You're going to critique the play. You're going to judge something based on the merits. You can support a side or a stand that you've made. All right, so here would be an example. Using their knowledge of product advertisement from previous lessons, the students will work in groups to develop a list of 3 products with effective advertising campaigns and 3 ineffective campaigns with justifications for decisions. All right, so what's that look like? We know it's the students. They're going to develop a list, and they're going to use their knowledge of product advertisement that they've worked from previous lessons, and they're going to work in groups. And what do they have to do? They have to have 3 products that have effective advertising campaigns and 3 ineffective campaigns with justification. All right, creating level. Organize the following. Predict what will happen next. What solutions would you suggest for? How would you design anew? Now, when we say organize the following, this isn't something that has a particular order and it can only be organized in one way. This is where something can be organized in multiple ways, and you're asking the students to use their thought process to say how they would organize it and then they can tell about that organization and why it works that way. All right, after reading If I Built a School, students will write in their journals to describe what type of school they would create using at least 4 rhyming words. All right, so this is something that would involve creation. They're creating something. So here it is. The students, that's our audience, they're going to describe what type of school they would create. And they're going to do it after they read a book called If I Built a School. And they're going to write in their journals. That's where their description is going to be written. And they have to use at least 4 rhyming words, because If I Built a School is a rhyming story. And so this is a way, objective that obviously has to do with poetry, probably. All right, so you might have noticed a couple things. As you move up from lower order to higher order thinking skills, it can be increasingly difficult to be precise in the degree of mastery. That's why you may refer to a rubric instead. But you need, and also it's important, choose correct key verbs to express the behavior you want the students to produce. Because that key word, verb, and the context it's in gives you the idea of, let you know which level order thinking skills you're asking your students to do. All right, so real briefly, let me show you what we're expecting you to do this week from Canvas. Okay, so here are the new things that are listed onto the Canvas site. What I've provided you is a bunch of links that have to do with Bloom's taxonomy and learning objectives. This first is the same PowerPoint that we just went over together. This is a great little video from an 8th grade science teacher that goes through Bloom's revised taxonomy, and I think she does a really good job of explaining the different levels. This is more information now about learning objectives. This is a Smith-Reagan text, a little bit of their book that describes what learning objectives are. Then these are some practice questions and some other information about learning objectives, and finally a little video. So that also what I want you to do then is, after you feel like you've got a good handle on learning objectives, I've developed a practice quiz. This is strictly practice. It will not be scored. It will not be graded. It's just for you to be able to check and see how well you know your information about learning objectives. Then next week, I'll give you an actual quiz that will be graded, and it'll be about learning objectives. Okay, I hope I haven't overwhelmed you. As always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Have a great week, and I'll talk with you later. Bye-bye.